The sun was out in West Memphis on May the 5th in 1993, and so naturally, kids were playing. Or maybe exploring is a better way to put it. That word would probably ring truer in the mind of 8-year-old Michael Moore, who strikes you as the sort of boy that might have considered himself a little too grown up for playing. He'd recently attained the rank of Wolf in his local Cub Scout group, and as far as Scouts go, they don't really come prouder than Michael, who wore his uniform just about everywhere he went. And so it was this afternoon, as he raced his bike toward the home of his best friend Stevie Branch. Stevie was a Scout too, though it wasn't so much a defining trait for him as it was for Mike. That would more so be the mischievous grin beneath a head of spiky blonde hair that his mother Pam would often say made him a dead ringer for Bart Simpson. Michael pulled up to Stevie's house a little after 3, and soon poor Pam was getting 2 ears full in a way only a mother with the unenviable task of trying to set rules for 8-year-olds can know. Michael and Stevie wanted to go out riding their bikes, naturally, but Pam had to set off for her work as a waitress at a local joint called Catfish Island at 5, and wanted her boy home, fed, and ready to wind down for the evening before she departed, a situation she found hard to picture if he were to be placed under the care of Mr. Moore, no offense intended of course. But after a barrage of pleases and sacred oaths of Scout's honor, Pam relented, and both parties reached a compromise. Home by 4:30 or 2 weeks grounded. She probably knew in the back of her mind as she was making that deal that she may as well have bypassed the test and gone straight to the punishment phase for how likely it was that Michael and Stevie would hold up their end of the bargain on this. But sometimes a mom just doesn't have any nose left in her. They were out the door not long past 3:20. And while Pam maybe should have known better, on the bright side she didn't have any more 8-year-old boys to keep an eye on. Until all of a sudden, she did. After Stevie and Michael's departure, Pam barely had time to blink twice before Christopher Byers was standing on her front porch at about 3:30, looking for none other than Stevie and Michael. Christopher was a more recent addition to the gang, and was often referred to by the nickname Worm, which might sound a little cruel, but it wasn't for nothing. He had ADHD, and a seemingly hard case of it too. Even when taking his prescribed Ritalin, Christopher had a real hard time staying still, often squirming around in his chair during classes, hence the nickname. But none of that stopped Chris from making friends, and his reaction upon being informed by Pam of Michael and Stevie's recent departure sort of shows you why. He asked if he could hang out and watch a screening of Muppet Babies that he could spot Pam's 4-year-old daughter Amanda viewing in the den. Why not, Pam thought, so Christopher sat, wriggled, and enjoyed the program without incident before heading off to find a new adventure at about 4 p.m. It was that sort of innocent, go-with-the-flow disposition that made Christopher Byers very easy to like, though it would also get him into trouble sometimes, and today would be such an occasion. Sometime around 5:30, he was spotted by his stepfather, John Mark Byers, lying flat on his skateboard rolling down the street a few doors down from home. Not exactly a high crime, but Christopher had apparently been under strict instruction to come home straight after school and wait for either John Mark or his 13-year-old half-brother Ryan to arrive before he was to even think about venturing out. John Mark was what we'll just call old-fashioned, so Christopher's disobedience earned him a few licks with a belt on his behind as soon as the two arrived home. It was a disciplinary action that John Mark will go on to say he's wished to take back 1,000,000 times. After the spanking, Christopher was told to clean up the carport to complete his punishment while John Mark went to pick up Ryan. The last time Christopher's mother Melissa saw him from the window of their home, he was dutifully undertaking this task at around 5:45 p.m. It couldn't have been too long past that point though that Christopher decided good enough was good enough, because at about 6 p.m, Michael Moore's mother Dana, who lived directly across from the Byers residence, remembers seeing Christopher, Michael and Stevie all heading up North 14th Street together in the direction of a wooded area known as Robin Hood Hills. Michael was on his bike, Stevie had Christopher on his, and any hidings or 4:30 p.m. curfews were now all but a distant memory. Shortly after 6:30 p.m, a 20-year-old man named Brian Woody, who'd just finished up work at a nearby car stereo shop, said he spotted the boys as he was driving home, approaching the point where 14th Street meets Goodwin Avenue. He made note of them because that Bart Simpson hair of Stevie's caught his eye, reminding him of his own little boy. And it was past that point that suddenly, people stopped seeing Michael, Christopher, and Stevie. For the next half hour or so, that wasn't really a problem. It very seldom is. Kids stay out past curfew all over the world every single day. An hour passes. Well, now you're starting to feel concerned. But don't get carried away. The little scamps probably just lost track of time. But every second after that, that reassuring voice in your head starts to fade further and further into the distance. At 8 p.m, John Mark Byers called the police. When they arrived at the Byers residence about 10 minutes later, Dana Moore's own escalating panic was further validated. As for Stevie's mother Pam, at this point she would have been mentally gearing up to issue a hard 2 weeks grounding with no ifs, ands, buts or maybes. By the time she was dropped off for work at 5, the sun was still up, and for all she knew, Stevie was probably 10 minutes away from returning home to answer to his stepfather, Terry Hobbs. Like a lot of people, the specific movements of Terry Hobbs in and around these hours aren't easy to nail down with certainty, but it is well attested to that he had come through the neighbourhood looking for Stevie after dropping Pam off a little past 5, and participated in what we'll call the preliminary search efforts a few hours later. As the hour approached 9 p.m, it was time for him to pick Pam up. When he did, shortly after 9, and told her Stevie had not come home, the first words out of her mouth were, "He's dead." To this day, Pam hasn't forgiven Terry for waiting until that moment to inform her of her son's disappearance. There had still been no sign of the boys by the following morning. The wooded area of Robin Hood Hills that they had last been seen headed towards had been scoured by officials and volunteers alike, yet seemingly held no clues. But that would abruptly and catastrophically change in the early afternoon, when a juvenile probation officer named Steve Jones stumbled upon a small, laceless black tennis shoe floating on the water of the creek that ran through the woods. Additional officers were then promptly called to the scene, and before long, Detective Sergeant Mike Allen was down in the water, wading toward that tennis shoe, when suddenly his foot got caught on about the last thing in the world you would ever want your foot to get caught on. Dislodged from the muddy bottom, the lifeless body of Michael Moore floated to the surface. It was the break in the case that everyone had been praying would never come. The bodies of Christopher Byers and Stevie Branch would be recovered further downstream very soon after. The boys had been stripped naked and their wrists and ankles bound in a peculiar hog tie, left to left, right to right. While a number of their injuries will need to be discussed in some detail later on when they become relevant as evidence, all to say for the time being is that they were shocking. Who on earth could do such a thing? If ever a question demanded an answer, it was that one in West Memphis circa 1993. Every year, thousands of homicide cases go unsolved in the United States, and the consensus among the townspeople, let alone the families of the children slain, was very clear. This would not, could not, be one of them. But unfortunately, whoever had been responsible for the slaughter had left very little of themselves behind. Couple such a lack of evidence with immense public pressure and even the occasional hideous taunt from unknown ghouls.
Police Department, I had a 1 TF3T, it's what's on.
And it's safe to say it was a very stressful time to be any sort of police officer in Crittenden County. Soon investigators were growing desperate. You sort of need to be to enlist the help of a woman like Vicky Hutchison. Vicky had first come to the attention of police the very same day the boys had been discovered, after she was reported by the truck stop she was employed at for credit card fraud. Hardly a ringing endorsement for a new recruit, but this is just background. Vicky was clearly tapped for last-minute daycare options because she brought her own 8-year-old son Aaron along to her interrogation over the alleged fraud, which very quickly sidetracked the matter at hand. Aaron said that he had been a friend of Michael and Christopher, which was true, and that he would often play with them in Robin Hood, which was also true, and that they had a clubhouse there in which they would sometimes hide and spy on a group of men having sex with each other. Holy shit, right? The thing is, Aaron's stories would only get wilder from there. He spoke of the men wearing paint, speaking Spanish, and singing about the devil. Eventually, he would claim to have been present during the actual crime, saying that he was attacked and tied up himself but managed to escape. A story that was not just fanciful, but impossible given he could be reliably placed elsewhere at the time. Chalk it up to a mix of imagination, trauma, and egging on by overly eager investigators yearning for a big break in the case. But the short version of the Aaron Hutchison saga is that while his series of police interviews didn't ultimately yield anything useful, the police interest in him did serve to bring his mother further into the fold of the investigation. And soon, she was offering to play detective. The police had developed a theory that there may have been an occult aspect to the crime. Devil worship, in other words. This was based on things such as the strange binding of the children, the overkill nature of their injuries, and rumours throughout the town of strange happenings going on in the woods. Make of that what you will, but the notion of such motives had caused several investigators to turn their attention to one Damien Eccles. 18-year-old Damien was known to walk around town dressed in all black and made no secret of his interest in the occult. Occult practices, whether they manifest as rituals and beliefs that fall under no particular umbrella, or a more formalized New Age religion such as Wicca, mean many things to many people. Some may view the occult as sinister and frightening, others dark and mysterious, or perhaps just pretentious and stupid, but in West Memphis, Arkansas, they were nothing if not outside the norm. And Vicky Hutchison thought that she might have an in with its most notable teenage practitioner. She had grown friendly with an associate of Damien's named Jesse Kelly Jr. The 17-year-old Jesse was a neighbour of Vicky's at the Highland Trailer Park. He was also dumb. Like, real dumb. With a reported IQ score of 72, it has been said by some standards he would qualify as borderline retarded. So when 30-year-old Vicky Hutchison approached Jesse and told him she'd really like to be introduced to his hot 18-year-old proto-goth friend, he didn't really ask any questions and set about organising a meet, which wound up taking place in Vicky's trailer home around mid to late May. Using a police officer's library card, Vicky had taken out several books on Wicca and other occult literature, placed them out where Damien would see them, and soon related to him her growing interest in witchcraft and the like.
If Damien were into witchcraft, naturally he's going to be curious why I have all this stuff I got.
Not much came of that meeting, but Vicky's report of what transpired the following evening is as sensational as it is unsubstantiated. She claimed that Damien picked her up in a red Escort and took her and Jesse to what was called an esbat, a fairly catch-all term for evening pagan rituals which aren't inherently sinister, but from what Vicky described, this was one of the creepy variety.
Occult, satanic meaning.
The esbat took place in some woods about 12 miles out of town. There were about 10 people present, none over the age of 18. Their faces were painted black, and soon they began disrobing and touching each other, at which point Vicky, quite understandably, told Damien that she would like to leave. Damien agreed and took her home, leaving Jesse at the creepy esbat. Vicky's story was unsettling enough, but did little if anything to implicate Damien Eccles in the triple homicide. It did, however, serve to bolster police interest in Jesse Kelly. If this slow fellow was close enough with Damien to accompany him to esbats, what sort of information might he be privy to should Damien be connected to the crime? So on the morning of June 3rd, they paid Jesse a visit at the Highland Trailer Park. With Miss Kelly being a minor at the time, his father, known as Big Jesse, had to provide permission for him to be taken in for questioning, which he readily did given he had no reason to suspect little Jesse had any involvement in the murders. If anything, he was hopeful that if his son did have any useful information, it may result in him laying claim to a $35,000 reward. But when little Jesse did arrive at the station, he was not met with promises of riches, but rather pointed questions that even a young man of Jesse's limited intellect could discern made him a person of interest in the case. Jesse was firm that he had no involvement in the murders, or any satanic orgies in the woods for that matter, and soon his assertions were put to the test of a polygraph. This channel has repeatedly made clear its position that the polygraph is nothing more than an interrogation prop, a tool of intimidation to make suspects feel like they've been put in a corner. And what transpired that day couldn't serve as a better case study to this effect. Upon reviewing Jesse's results, Detective Bill Durham exclaimed to his colleagues that the boy was, quote, lying his ass off. That claim has been the subject of much debate over the years, but how the charts truly looked, or whether the investigators actually had confidence in their validity, doesn't really matter. What does matter is that the exercise had its intended effect of making little Jesse feel like he was in big trouble. And soon he was telling a very different story about his activities on May the 5th to Inspector Gary Gitchell and Detective Brian Ridge.
Wednesday, early in the morning, you received a phone call, is that correct?
Yes, I did.
And who made that phone call?
Jason Baldwin.
Miss Kelly's implication of Jason Baldwin was somewhat out of left field. The 16-year-old lived in Lakeshore Trailer Park across from Jesse, and he had been briefly looked at by police before this point. But that was more or less because he was known to be best friends with Damien Eccles. He himself was never at the top of anyone's suspect list before the interrogation of Jesse Miss Kelly.
What did he talk about?
He told me he had to go to West Memphis, so him and Damien went, then I went with him.
Now, were you in a car? Whose car were you on?
We walked.
Y'all walked? Okay.
Right, we walked, and then
Where did you go?
we went to Robin Hood.
What occurred while you were there?
I saw Damien hit this one boy real bad.
All right, you've got in front of you a picture that was taken out of the newspaper, I believe. It's got 3 boys. And these are the 3 boys that were killed on that date in Robin Hood Woods. Which one of those 3 boys is it you say Damien hit? The third picture, which will be...
Michael Moore.
This boy right here?
Yeah.
All right, that's the Byers boy.
Christopher.
That's who you're pointing at?
Mm-hmm.
If you'll read the caption, the grisly slaying from left, 8-year-old Michael Moore, Stephen Branch, and Christopher Byers. Okay. So, you saw Damien strike Chris Byers in the head.
Right.
What did he hit him with?
He hit him with his fist and bruised him all up real bad. And then Jason turned around and hit Steve Branch and started doing the same thing. Then the other one took off. Michael Moore took off running. So I chased him and grabbed him and held him till they got there, and then I left.
When did they take their clothes off?
Right after they beat up all 3 of them and beat them up real bad.
And then they took their clothes off. Then they tied them.
Then they tied them up, tied their hands up. And then I took off running. I went home. And then they called me and asked me how come I didn't stay. I told them I just couldn't.
Just couldn't stay for long.
I couldn't stand to see what they was doing to them.
You saw somebody with a knife. Who had a knife?
Jason.
Would you see him cut, or who did you see him cut?
I saw him cut one of the little boys.
All right, where did he cut him at?
He was cutting him in the face.
Cutting him in the face. All right. Another boy was cut, I understand. Where was he cut at?
At the bottom. He was...
Now, you talking about bottom, do you mean right here?
Mm-hmm.
In his groin area? Okay. Which boy was that?
That right there.
You're talking about the Byers boy again? Okay.
Had Damien seen these boys before?
Yes.
I got a feeling here. You're not quite telling me everything. If you were there the whole time, then tell us you were there the whole time. Don't leave anything out.
I was there until they tied him up. And then that's when I left. After they tied him up, I left.
But you saw him cutting on the boys.
I saw him cutting on them. And then
So what else left is there after that?
They laid the knives down beside them. And I saw them tying them up. And then that's when I left.
Did you see any of the boys actually killed?
Yes.
Okay. Which one did you see killed?
That right there.
Yes, you're pointing to the Byers boy again?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And how was he actually killed?
He choked him real bad, like
What was he choking him with?
a stick, kind of holding it over his neck.
When they killed the boys, you decided to go. You went home. How long after you got home before you received a phone call? 30 minutes? An hour? So they were there for a lot longer.
Mm-hmm. And then Damien, I heard Damien in the background saying, we done it, what we gonna do now? What about if somebody saw us?
And with that, police had the suspects that would become known to the world as the West Memphis Three. Soon their images would be beamed into living rooms across the country, and they were quite the sight to behold. The small, solemn Jesse Kelly, whose 5'1" stature was dwarfed by every law enforcement officer that escorted him to and from court appearances. A defiant, some might say smug Damien Eccles, whose dark appearance and demeanour made him a sort of composite of all the troubling boys in school every parent tells their kid to stay away from. And Jason Baldwin, 16 but looking all of 12, himself a sort of composite of all those kids being told to stay away from that troubling boy in school, all standing accused of one of the most grisly crimes imaginable. It all certainly made great fodder for crime reporters at the time, and tabloid talk shows of course, where no subject can be overly sensationalized.
Did the devil make them do it? We're examining a brutal triple homicide. 3 8-year-olds hacked to death down in West Memphis.
And no question too stupid.
You feel that your son may have been involved in the satanic cult itself? Because now kids are very impressionable, and you never know.
No, these kids were 8 years old. There's
not a child.
No.
And in '93 especially, the alleged occult aspect made the case absolutely irresistible for a media in the grips of satanic panic.
Adding to the parents' horrors were reports that the killers had participated in devil worship. In June of last year, 1993, the Memphis Commercial Appeal reported that cult experts had warned West Memphis officials back in 1992 that satanic cult activities were present in the community. What's the dagger you're holding?
Well, when I point out that this kind of stuff is available, you can go to warehouses. There are occult warehouses in the country where you can buy this kind of stuff.
See the skull on top of the rubies?
Spooky stuff. But while the rest of the world was getting understandably riled up by all of this, some behind the scenes were beginning to wonder if something had not gone terribly, terribly wrong in this investigation. One of them was a man named Dan Stidham, an attorney brought on to present Jesse Kelly's defense. Jesse would wind up recanting his confession.
Well, I was telling them, I don't know nothing about it, and they just kept on egging it on. Finally, I just said something where they'd just leave me alone. Finally, I told them, I chased them and everything and caught them and brought them back. But none of that happened.
No big deal. It wouldn't be the first time a perp spilled the beans thinking there was no way out before trying to rebottle them after deciding they might have an angle after all. Stidham went into the case thinking that his job would probably be convincing Jesse to formally roll in his accomplices in court in the hope of negotiating some kind of plea deal. But upon actually meeting Jesse and reviewing the contents of his confession, Dan Stidham began to see some problems. And truth be told, he didn't have to look all that hard.
And about what time was it that all this was taking place?
I was at about 12.
About noon? Okay. Was it after school? Had let out?
I didn't go to school.
What, these other boys?
They skipped school.
Now, did you say the boys skipped school that day? These little boys did?
Mm-hmm.
Are you sure?
They was going somewhere, and like I said, Damien and them left before I did. I told them I'd meet them there.
The boys certainly hadn't skipped school that day, and their murders obviously hadn't taken place around noon. Those facts were clearly not lost on the investigators.
What time did you get there?
I got there about 9.
In the morning?
Mm-hmm.
Of Wednesday morning?
Mm-hmm.
What time is it right now?
Right now?
Yeah.
Do you not wear a watch?
It's at home.
So your time period might not be exactly right what you're saying.
Right.
But it was like early in the day, but you don't know exactly what time. Because I've got some real confusion with the times you're telling me. But rather than continuing to try to clear that confusion up, they decided to just press forward. It seemed to be sort of an approach of tell us what works and we'll just clean the rest up later, which is exactly what they wound up doing.
When a judge told police he would need the quote, obvious discrepancy in time cleared up before issuing urgent search and arrest warrants for the three, Gitchell got Miss Kelly on tape again, and now, all of a sudden, he had things happening right when they needed to.
When you three were in the woods and then the little boys come up, about what time was it?
5 or 6.
Oh, still a smidge too early actually. Let's try that again.
Aren't you told me earlier it's around 7 or 8 or which time is it?
It's 7 or 8.
There we go. Notice Gitchell is the first to actually say the correct answer too. In fact, there seemed to be a tendency where the more open the question was, the more liable Miss Kelly was to get details wrong.
And what did they use to tie them up?
A rope.
Okay. What color was the rope?
Brown.
There was no rope. The boys had been bound with their own shoelaces. But why would anyone, no matter their level of intelligence, falsely implicate themselves in such a serious crime? That's a question Dan Stidham sought to answer with two experts he had take the stand. Polygraph specialist Warren Holmes explained that badgering by police, including but not limited to claims of a failed polygraph, can cause some to break down and issue a false confession essentially just to end the confrontation, low IQ individuals being particularly prone to such an action. Sociologist and expert on coerced confessions Richard Offshee concurred and expressed his opinion that Miss Kelly's confession was, quote, more likely a product of influence than any real memory of the crime, pointing to examples such as detectives seeming to insinuate a later time than Miss Kelly had originally stated by offering suggestions such as, was it after school let out? Ultimately though, the jury was unconvinced. On February 5th, 1994, Jesse Miss Kelly was found guilty and sentenced to life plus 40 years. By this point, an HBO film crew working on a project that would become Paradise Lost, a much-lauded documentary series on the case, had begun filming goings-on in and outside the courtroom.
Prison's not a safe place. Jesse, sweetie, I'm gonna mail him a skirt.
1 down, 2 to go. Hopefully the same thing will happen to the next 2 and we'll get the same verdict.
But getting guilty verdicts for Damien Eccles and Jason Baldwin was not going to be quite the cakewalk that prosecutors would have hoped for. With Miss Kelly's confession recanted, and Jesse ultimately passing on the opportunity to unrecant it and testify against them in the hopes of a reduced, albeit still severe sentence, it could not be introduced at their trials, and without it, there was very scant evidence connecting them to the crime. Among that scant evidence, a tiny speck of blue wax thought to be from a candle found on Stevie Branch's shirt was consistent with blue wax found in a book seized from Eccles' trailer, which is basically to say they were about the same colour. No actual candles were recovered from Eccles' home, but one was found in the trailer of his girlfriend, Dominique Tier. Again, about the same colour. Also in the vein of about the same colour, a handful of fibres found on some of the victims' clothes were determined to be microscopically similar to some garments recovered from the homes of Eccles and Baldwin, though we're not talking about remarkably obscure materials here, specifically rayon, polyester, and cotton. More menacing than candles and threads was a large Rambo knife recovered from a lake behind Baldwin's trailer home. It certainly looked scary enough, but while prosecutor John Fogelman would claim, subject to much contention, that its serrations were consistent with various cutting wounds on the boys, the fact remained there was no physical evidence connecting the knife itself to the victims or the crime scene. So now you may be starting to get a picture of the state's position. It wasn't that they had nothing, but damned if they were not uncomfortably close. And when you're in such a position, you're liable to start really reaching. If you're not careful, you might just put a man like Dr. Dale Griffiths on the stand to back you up. Griffiths was the sort of character that Saturday Night Live might cook up if they were trying to depict a caricature encapsulating the Satanic Panic era. Although he once worked as a police officer himself, he'd carved out a new career educating law enforcement on how to spot signs of satanic involvement in crime scenes, which, fortunately for him, were everywhere.
Do you have an opinion as to whether or not there are occult overtones or evidence of occult involvement in these particular murders?
Well, the date being close to Beltane, a holiday, May 1st. Also, the day before that is Walpurgisnacht. Then you go into the fact that some groups, occult groups, will use a full moon.
But the occult overtones of the crime didn't stop at full moons and being quite close to various obscure days of observance. Griffiths would testify that Satanists have a, quote, midline theory of the body, associating right with Christianity and left with Satan, and that this puts some significance on the fact that Stevie Branch was found to have severe abrasions to the left side of his face. Even something as elementary as the presence of water, that being the creek in which the bodies were found, seemed to strike the good doctor as sinister. Occultists sometimes use that sort of thing for baptisms and such, as do Christians, Dr. Griffiths made sure to qualify. It was the sort of testimony that made one wonder, what kind of doctor is this guy exactly?
How were you accepted into enrollment at Columbia Pacific University?
I had to fill out a considerable series of papers.
Did you ever fill out a little flyer like this?
No, sir.
That says, call toll-free for information on how to become a doctor? This is a mail-order college, isn't it? What classes did you take?
I told you, I answered that before, none.
You did not take any classes. Between 1982 and 1984, when you became a PhD, what classes did you take?
None.
None. Okay.
Columbia Pacific University would eventually shut down after the state of California determined they did not meet educational standards. Whether or not the jury actually put a lot of weight on the sort of expertise offered by Griffiths, they did ultimately find the remaining two defendants guilty. Jason Baldwin was sentenced to life, Eccles to death, yet the tale of the West Memphis Three was just beginning. All three continued to maintain their innocence as teens whose only crime was wearing black, showing an interest in unfairly stigmatized alternative religion, and listening to heavy metal.
Our favorite kinds of music were like Slayer, Metallica, Megadeth, U2.
All in a place that had little understanding of such things, and at a time where a monstrous crime demanded a resolution.
If you could go back to your life before the trial and change anything, would you?
I wouldn't change anything that's ever happened in my entire life. Nothing. Everything that has happened in my life has came together to create and make me the person that I am now. And if any of those things were changed, then the person who I now am would not exist. So there's no.
But the person that you are today is sitting on death row. You want to change that?
I don't think there was anything I could do to change that. What was it? I mean, become a clone, give up my personality, give up my identity, just march along like everyone else. I'd rather die first.
And when the first Paradise Lost documentary released in 1996, it gave many cause to wonder if they might be telling the truth. Not only was the evidence presented thin, many in the nation's more metropolitan areas did not feel the same sense of foreboding when gazing upon the dark boy at the center of everything as the residents of West Memphis seemed to. To many, Eccles seemed very much like they were as a teenager, in some cases much like they were right now. Ditto Miss Kelly and Baldwin in their own respective ways. Soon a supporter movement was growing, gathering resources and raising funds for the sorts of lawyers the three were never in a position to afford at the time they stood accused. These efforts were documented in a follow-up to Paradise Lost, and while that project was being filmed, John Mark Byers began to behave as if he were auditioning for the role of the most suspicious man who has ever existed on the face of planet Earth.
You want to worship the devil? See him. I'm going to give you a farewell party. What do you think? You ready to die? Fire for fire. Burn, you son of a bitch, burn. Burn, go to hell, burn. Stomp on your grave, a stomp on your grave. Burn and go to hell.
It wasn't that John Mark's anger would have been anything but understandable, but the theatrical way in which he expressed it felt off to many. Severe grief and a desire to put on a show for cameras just didn't intuitively feel like two things that normally go hand in hand.
Seems like he's play acting, trying to divert the attention, trying to play the role that he should be of an angered parent.
It also didn't help this wasn't actually the first time Byers had questionable interactions with the filmmakers. During production of the first film, he had bizarrely decided to give one of the cameramen a gift in the form of a Kershaw knife he claimed to have never used before. So you can imagine the filmmakers' shock when they discovered blood on it. The knife was immediately handed over to police, and John Mark soon changed his story of having never used it before, saying he'd forgotten he nicked himself on it while cutting venison once.
I'd had trimmed your toenails with it. I had attempted to trim on some venison that I had.
Do you remember giving the answer, no, that knife had not been used at all. It had just been kept up, put in my dresser, and I didn't use it, and the reason why was because of the serrated edges.
No, sir, I don't recall giving him that exact answer. I'm sure his question wouldn't have been asked exactly like your question.
All right. Did you have any idea how human blood was on that knife?
Well, yes, I would have an idea. I cut my thumb.
On the top of page 8, do you recall being asked the question? I have no idea how it could have any human blood on it. Do you recall giving that answer?
Yes, sir.
Then do you recall stating, I don't even remember nicking myself with it, cutting the deer meat or anything? Is that the answer you gave?
Yes, sir.
And is that the truth?
At the time when he was questioning me, I didn't I might not have remembered. We were getting ready to go into a trial.
Testing was ultimately inconclusive, showing the blood to be consistent with John Mark's adopted son Christopher, but also, rather coincidentally, John Mark Byers himself. Still though, it would be hard to fault anyone for wanting to keep an eye on the man after such a questionable episode, especially after Melissa Byers died under mysterious circumstances in 1996 at the age of 40, purportedly in her sleep lying next to John Mark. Official cause of death, undetermined. Meanwhile, in the process of re-evaluating physical evidence from the murders, defense experts had noted marks on the boys they believed to be consistent with human bite marks, most notably above Stevie's left eyebrow, and those marks didn't match impressions from any of the convicted.
And you're very convinced 100% they're guilty, right? And you're 100% convinced of your own innocence. So why don't you give your bite impressions to the defense?
I have no problem with a polygraph, sodium pentothal, being hypnotized, bite marks, or anything else which I've submitted to every test they have asked.
But then you have
Take your
bite mark impressions? I mean, if you're not convinced. Dental records. How could you give your bite impressions if you don't have your teeth?
What if I told you that the teeth that I had before they were pulled, that the teeth that I had during it, I know the oral surgeons and all that did the work, and I would be glad to sign a release for them to send my x-rays.
Will you do that?
If need be.
It seemed like John Mark might be implying he had his real teeth during the time of the murders, something supporter Kathy Backen sought clarification on in a later exchange.
Aren't you going to give your bite impressions to the defense?
There's not going to be any need to that. I'll be taking a polygraph very soon. And when that's all cleared, why should I give bite marks? They were done before the kids were murdered. Strikes all that theory out.
You had your dentures right when they died?
No, I've had them since 93 at the start.
But that just wasn't true. Byers' dental record showed the extraction was done in April of '97, not only after the murders, but also around the time that bite marks were emerging as a defense talking point. In spite of all these disquieting circumstances, however, the Byers lead ultimately proved to be a dead end.
Give me a high five. Thank you. I knew it was right. I knew I was innocent.
What it really came down to was time. The boys were last seen at 6:30ish, and John Mark called the police at 8. It couldn't be said that John Mark had an ironclad, verifiable alibi for that 90-minute window. However, to commit the murders, he would need to get himself to the woods, carry out the slayings, and control the 3 children, presumably without an accomplice, push them down into the mud of the creek bed so they wouldn't float, get back to the neighborhood without anyone in the community noticing him caked in mud, and then get cleaned up before making the 911 call, all without Melissa Byers noticing anything untoward to boot. Whether such a scenario was impossible might be open to debate, but it was certainly far too fanciful to base a successful appeal off of. Not to mention, just as with the West Memphis 3, there was nothing in the way of hard physical evidence connecting Byers or any alternate suspect to the crime scene. In 2007, however, this would change somewhat. New testing on one of the shoelaces used to bind Michael Moore established that a single hair underneath the ligature had a DNA profile that excluded the 3, but did not exclude Stevie Branch's stepfather, Terry Hobbs. In addition, a hair found on a nearby tree stump, which also excluded all the 3, would not exclude a man by the name of David Jacoby, a friend of Hobbs who, by the admission of both men, was with Terry in and around those crucial hours of May 5th. Now, it's important to clarify what does not exclude means in this instance. The type of DNA recovered was what's called mitochondrial DNA, that's passed down a maternal line sharing a common ancestor. It's much more of a broad profile than the sort of exact match you'll often hear about in smoking gun cases. The hair that wouldn't exclude Hobbs would also not exclude about 1.5% of the population, 7% in Jacoby's case. Even the West Memphis 3 defense team conceded the discovery wouldn't be enough to base a successful prosecution off of. But therein lies the point.
What we know now are 2 things. Terry Hobbs could be the source of that hair on the ligature. None of the defendants could be the source of that hair on the ligature. None of the DNA evidence from the crime scene connects any of the defendants to the scene of the crime.
All we know is that a report arrives from a scientific lab that says your client has no evidence at the crime scene. We have located someone who's consistent. By the way, that someone who's consistent is someone who certainly was in the area. I mean, do we not present that? Is that not a compelling argument for a judge trying to decide if Eccles would be convicted? I'm just telling you that absent the kind of prejudice that was generated in 1993, a competent trial lawyer could not lose Damian Eccles' case today, because there's not a single piece of credible evidence that connects him to the scene, and anything that they say is credible is far outweighed by things that could point in other directions. No reasonable juror would find guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Conversely, any reasonable juror, in this case tried today, would have a reasonable doubt. The jury would acquit.
And as more scrutiny was applied to Hobbs in light of these new discoveries, additional circumstantial evidence also began to emerge. To begin with, Hobbs being responsible would not have required the same logistical feat John Mark Byers would need to accomplish. He had been seen in the neighborhood sometime past 5 p.m. looking for Stevie after he'd broken curfew. It's also well attested to that he was participating in early search efforts from about 8:30 p.m. before going to pick Pam up from work at 9. But in that absolutely crucial time period in between, whenever Terry offered an alibi witness, it seemed he would reliably be contradicted. Long story short, no one has ever gone on record to claim they saw Terry Hobbs actively searching for the boys between 6 and 8:30 p.m. Soon many people would be making many other claims about him, however.
We came outside to go to church at 6:30, but I saw Terry coming down the sidewalk here, coming this direction, and he was calling for Stephen to come back down to their house. The police or no one ever came by our house. They were around our house playing at 6:30. They were over here in this neighborhood. I never knew until this year that he was saying that he didn't see them at all. He's not telling the truth. He was out there with them.
A neighbor now claiming to have seen Terry with the boys, possibly after what had previously been the last sighting, was a giant revelation if it was to be believed. Terry had always claimed to have seen none of the boys at any point that day. Long since divorced, Pam and her family would soon come forward with even more shocking claims. Just some of the highlights. Pam's sister, Jo Lynn, claimed in a sworn affidavit that on May 6th, the day the bodies were discovered, she witnessed Terry washing clothes, bedding, and curtains at an odd hour, and that she found it highly suspicious he would be so preoccupied with that task of all things during such a devastating time. She and multiple other members of the family would also allege his daughter Amanda confided in them claims of sexual abuse from Terry, both of her and Stevie before his murder. But perhaps most devastating for Pam was a discovery in Terry's nightstand. 10 years after the murders in 2003, she came across a small pocket knife when going through one of his drawers. She immediately recognized it as a pocket knife gifted to Stevie by his granddad that Stevie loved and took with him wherever he went. She had always been surprised it wasn't found on him when his body was recovered. Terry claimed he'd confiscated it from Stevie in the days preceding the murders, thinking the boy to be too young to carry a pocket knife. And though Pam has never outright accused Terry of being involved, his explanation has never sat right with her. They were divorced within a year of that discovery, and soon Pam was publicly expressing misgivings about the guilt of the West Memphis Three.
I would like to see another trial, give them a fair trial, present the evidence that really wasn't presented in the other trials, and if they're guilty, so be it, that's where they stay. But if they're not, God, don't put somebody to death because, oops.
John Mark Byers, too. Though, unlike Pam, he did outright accuse Terry Hobbs of being the culprit.
No alibi. Can't count for the crucial times from 6:30 to 8, 8:30 to 9, 10 to 11:15, and from 2:30 to 5 a.m. That's a lot of gap in time of what were you doing, Mr. Hobbs? Where were you? Inconsistent statement. He never saw any of the boys that day. We know that's wrong. He was seen by 3 witnesses that were neighbors. That could have come out back on May 5th or 6th if the West Memphis PD would have canvassed that neighborhood. They just canvassed this neighborhood.
Oh, and Vicky Hutchison also came forward to announce she just straight up lied about that entire satanic SBAT story.
I testified to it, but I lied on the stand.
So that was helpful. All of these new discoveries, among other defense contentions, came to a head in 2010 when the Arkansas Supreme Court ordered an evidentiary hearing wherein the 3 would be able to present all their findings since their convictions with an eye on being granted a retrial. Now, this probably sounds like the part of the movie where all the protagonists leap to their feet in victory, filled with newfound hope and excitement for the final battle. But the lived reality of the 3 was no such fairy tale, of course. A new trial seemed all but certain given recent developments, though all but certain would still feel uncomfortably shaky if you'd spent nearly 2 decades in prison waiting for the good news. In the same vein, while the evidence against them was thin, so it was in '94. They had more evidence now, more funding, better lawyers, a completely different political climate, but at the end of the day, you just never know what a jury is going to do. The months leading up to the date of that hearing weren't jubilant for the convicted. They were scary. And they weren't the only ones who were scared. Over on the prosecutor's side of the fence, newly minted DA Scott Ellington was feeling the heat. If these men wound up being exonerated, not only would the state of Arkansas have candle wax all over its face, but things could get very expensive very quickly. 3 wrongful convictions, followed by 18 years in prison, with one of those convicted spending that time on death row? Who's to say what the final bill would come to once the state was done compensating them? So in the end, there was no final showdown. Instead, they struck a deal.
Subject to the court's approval, certain dispositive agreements have been reached by and between the state and the defendants in this case. The offered plea, it's a guilty plea with a profession of innocence.
And it's not something you're very likely to be offered should you ever find yourself on the wrong side of the law. As stated, an Alford plea allows you to openly maintain your innocence while formally entering a plea of guilty, and it's very rarely used because it's every bit as contradictory as it sounds. After all, why would the state accept that if they were confident enough to bring charges in the first place? So when it is utilised, it's often for reasons such as expediency, or in this case, when both sides feel like they have too much to lose in an all-or-none game. The result? Damien, Jesse and Jason would walk free, but remain convicted, with their 18 years behind bars being treated as time served. The case would therefore remain closed, as would the door to any wrongful imprisonment lawsuits against the state. A bitter pill to swallow, but after enough time in solitude facing the prospect of execution...
To be honest, it wasn't that difficult. I'm just tired. You know, this has been going on for over 18 years, and it's been an absolute living hell.
Is it bittersweet?
It's not perfect. It's not perfect by any means, but at least it brings closure to some areas and some aspects. You know, we can still bring up new evidence. We can still continue the investigations we've been doing. We can still try to clear our names. The only difference is now we can do it from the outside instead of having to sit in prison and do it.
Jesse Miskelly saw it much the same way, though Jason Baldwin had initially told his attorneys he wasn't interested.
This was not justice, you know. In the beginning, we told nothing but the truth, that we were innocent, and they sent us to prison for the rest of our lives for it. And then we had to come here, and the only thing that the state would do for us was to say, hey, we'll let you go, only if you admit guilt. And that's not justice, no matter how you look at it. They're not out there trying to find who really murdered those boys. And I did not want to take the deal from the get-go. However, they're trying to kill Damien, and sometimes you just gotta fight the gun to save somebody.
I want to publicly thank Jason too, just to let him know that I do acknowledge what he did, that he did want to keep fighting. He didn't want to take this deal in the beginning, and I recognize and acknowledge that he did do it almost entirely for me. Thank you.
Mr. Braga.
But it wasn't all hugs and cheers outside the courthouse.
This is not justice.
Who do you believe is the real killer?
Terry Wayne Hobbs.
Amen. And David.
I don't know how much clearer I have to make it. This is not right. And the people of Arkansas need to stand up and raise hell, because 3 innocent men are going to have to claim today that they're guilty for a crime they didn't know. And that's bullshit.
And of course, there were others who were angry for different reasons, who felt the arrangement was not bittersweet but an outright travesty, that justice was denied not because the 3 had to remain convicted but because they were released, that the West Memphis 3 were tried and found guilty not because of coerced confessions or satanic panic run amok in God-fearing Arkansas, but because they did it. I want to go where the monsters go. Those rather cartoonishly ominous words were spoken by Damien Eccles on January 5th, 1993, during an interview with a psychiatrist from the East Arkansas Mental Health Center. And it was far from the first time the young man had said or done something that one might find unsettling. He was first institutionalized in May of 1992. It isn't all too uncommon for teenagers to deal with mental health issues or for their parents to be concerned about them. But the situation for Damien's mom and dad was more severe than that. They had grown to be afraid of him, not only for what he may be capable of doing to them, but the 2 young children who also resided in the home. They were growing increasingly alarmed by his spiritual practices, which he termed as witchcraft, sometimes demonology, but they described as Satanism or devil worship. Whatever the correct term may have been for his religious beliefs, it would seem fair to describe him as an arsonist, as he freely admitted to deliberately lighting a fire in a classroom and had been accused of burning or attempting to burn other properties on separate occasions. But fire starting didn't account for the bulk of his 7 suspensions from school. His antisocial behavior had been known to escalate to interpersonal violence more than once, perhaps most notably when he attempted to gouge a pair's eyes out with his fingernails, which he had filed into points. Then there was the blood drinking. Though Damien spoke of having one friend, a blood brother who he had exchanged blood with and would die for, the only mark of a true friend according to Damien, that was about as innocuous as his fascination with the body fluid got. One incident involved Damien sucking blood from a fellow patient who had recently slashed his wrist after knocking him to the ground. Another time he sucked blood from a peer's neck. He spoke quite openly about his enjoyment of the practice, saying that drinking blood gave him power and strength, and that it made him feel like a god. If these sorts of actions made Damien scary in some people's minds, he didn't seem to care. One might get the impression he relished it. When speaking to one social worker, he confided that sometimes he would blow up, and when that happened, the only solution was to hurt someone. He recalled being told at one hospital where he was being treated that he could be another Charles Manson or Ted Bundy. "I know I'm going to influence the world," he said. "People will remember me." I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. I don't know what to do. Those words were spoken by attorney Dan Stidham as he desperately paced the halls of the Arkansas Department of Corrections, according to the recollection of prosecutor Brent Davis, who had made the trip there with him. Mr. Stidham was apparently in a real state that afternoon, which you could hardly fault the man for. It was only Tuesday, and he'd already had one hell of a week. Last Friday, he had just wrapped up defending Jesse Miskelly all the way to a life sentence for triple homicide. Hardly his fault. Why don't you try educating a jury on the phenomenon of false confessions with both hands tied behind your back? The judge had limited the scope of questioning for his expert witnesses so much he wasn't even allowed to ask them if they felt the confession was voluntary or not because the court had already ruled that it was. Oh, and even the testimony he had gotten out of them hadn't been 100% helpful. When he'd asked Warren Holmes for indications of false confessions, Holmes felt the need to also mention signs of valid ones while giving his answer, stating that if you make a supposition that's wrong, they'll tell you you're wrong.
I went with them, and then
Now, were you in a car? Whose car were you on?
we walked.
Y'all walked? Okay.
Right, we walked, and then
He could have at least waited for cross-examination for that one. Oh, but no matter, they were cooked from the start. It was the wrong time and the wrong place for any hopes of a fair trial. Dan Stidham always knew the chances of a full acquittal were next to nil. But there was an appeals process, light at the end of a long tunnel for those that play their cards right. There was still hope. And now? Now, his client, this stupid boy, was confessing again. It all started, or restarted, right here.
I'm gonna mail him a skirt.
Apparently, Jesse wanted to pass the time on his ride to prison by talking. And what better topic of conversation than his activities on May the 5th last year? According to the officers that transported him, Jesse had told them a very similar account as he had given to his interrogators back in June of '93, but now with brand new details. Jesse told them he felt he had been tricked into doing what he did. Before the murders, he had been drinking whiskey. Damien and Jason were drinking beer, and they had all shared a couple of marijuana joints earlier. After entering the woods, they had actually begun playing around in the creek that would soon become a watery grave. Damien had spotted the boys from a distance and told Jesse and Jason to hide in some nearby bushes. Michael Moore had been the first accosted. Chris and Stevie then heroically attempted to fight the much larger teenager off to save their friend. It was then that Jesse and Jason emerged and joined in beating the children. Jesse gave some details that still ran counter to the prosecution theory, saying that Jason used a buck-type knife to, quote, cut it all off, presumably referencing the emasculation of Christopher Byers, and that he threw it in some weeds. Jesse had been surprised that blood didn't get on him at that point, as it was spurting everywhere and he was only standing a car distance away. It was shortly after that Jesse said he left. Jason and Damien were supposedly taking a still squirming Christopher Byers into the water while Michael and Stevie lay unconscious on the ground. Jesse even felt the need to tell the officers he had given his interrogators wrong information about the time of day and the rope to trick them and see if they were lying. Jesus H. Christ, the state couldn't pay this kid to make life harder for Dan Stidham. Here he was, still lying on himself, even after all the trouble it got him into the first time. And for what? A better deal? He wants to try for that after sentencing? Oh, you stupid boy. But it didn't end there. Oh no, Dan Stidham wasn't pacing prison halls on the verge of mental breakdown for fun. Word had been passed on to him of his client's reacquired taste for incriminating statements, and that Jesse now wanted to go on record with the prosecutors who were gearing up to try his former friends, and tell them whatever they wanted to know without so much as making a deal for a reduction of his sentence. Not if Dan Stidham had anything to do with it, he wouldn't. When Stidham and prosecutors Brent Davis and John Fogelman arrived at Arkansas Corrections, Stidham went straight to the room Jesse was waiting for them in to provide his obviously much-needed counsel. Davis and Fogelman waited outside. 10 to 15 minutes passed before an ashen-faced Stidham re-emerged. But he still needed some time with his client. He just had to grab something. Jesse wanted a Bible. Soon Stidham had obtained it, and Jesse again sat across from him, one hand resting on the holy book. It was just Dan and Jesse alone in that room, which was good, though no one to point to as coercing anything after the fact, which was bad. Jesse Miskelly affirmed to Dan Stidham that he, Jason, and Damien had been responsible for the murders. The narrative he provided was much the same as he'd given on his ride to prison, now with even more harrowing details. Some seemed to align with specific facts of the case. The blonde boy got cut up on the left side of his face. This tracked with Stevie's injuries. At one point, Damien had pleasured himself and wiped off on the same boy's pants. A stain had been found on Stevie's pants, possibly semen, but this was never established as fact due to how much the stain had been diluted in the water. His account of the emasculation of Chris Byers hadn't changed much. Jason cut it off, then threw something away. Maybe the knife, maybe Christopher's privates, he couldn't be sure. No knives had been recovered from the scene, no genitals either. One thing that had remained a constant from day one was that Jesse was responsible for at very least the lion's share of the damage done to Michael Moore, beating him from the outset, then again after chasing him down at Damien's command. This was broadly consistent with the facts. Michael was found further upstream, and he hadn't been hacked and slashed like the other two. It would seem he had been pummeled to death's door before being finished off by the water. Had Jesse just picked this shit up at trial? It would stand to reason because in some areas he was still all over the place. The three hadn't been playing in the water before the boys came anymore. He had just told the police that last Friday for no reason in particular, it seemed. He also told them lies about cooking dogs and eating them at cult meetings. Oh well, at least after all of this, he was still able to keep a sense of humor. But he wasn't telling Dan Stidham the cult meetings were all made up. No, he went to those with Jason, Damien, and a handful of other people he struggled to name. No car necessary, just some backwoods out at Lakeshore near his home. They'd all stand around in a circle holding candles and watch Damien talk to the devil. Just, standard. One night, Jesse got a look at a Polaroid picture Damien had brought with him. It was of, quote, 3 boys that was on a bicycle by some white houses. It meant nothing to Jesse at the time, but he would later recognize them as the 3 he had helped slaughter on May the 5th. No way. No way! That must have been the gist of what was going through Dan Stidham's mind as he paced those prison halls. It can't be true! And in fact, none of Jesse Miskelly's confessions, of which there are 5 officially committed to record, can even be argued to be 100% true. All of them contradict each other in various ways, and even themselves in certain moments. But what really matters, of course, is not whether they are entirely true, but whether the crux of them is true. And how would one go about putting that to the test at this point? That question may have taken Dan Stidham's mind back to something that Warren Holmes had said at trial about truthful confessions. Sometimes it isn't the fundamentals you should look at, but the incidentals. Holmes explained that when someone is drawing from real memories, it won't just be details pertinent to the crime they'll tell you about. They'll also recall little non-criminal details from in and around that time. And if you can verify such a detail, that can help heighten the odds that the rest of what they were telling you, or the crux of it at least, was also true. Jesse had told Stidham he was drunk on whiskey at the time. Evan Williams specifically. More importantly, he had been in such a state of rage and disgust when stumbling home from the atrocity that he had felt moved to throw the bottle to the ground, shattering it beneath an overpass. His memory was even vivid enough to pinpoint the overpass between Walmart and Lakeshore. If they could find that bottle, then he'd believe what his client was telling him. At least that was the commitment that prosecutor Brent Davis recalls being conveyed to him. So Stidham, Davis and Fogelman all got back in the car and began making their way from the Department of Corrections in Pine Bluff to the Overpass of Truth in West Memphis. Whether or not Jesse was lying though, really, what are the odds of finding a single broken bottle under a bridge nearly a year after it's been busted? But it would seem that the litter management of West Memphis was less than world class, because when they arrived, it was as if those shards had been waiting for them. They even took them to a nearby liquor store for safety, and put the shards back together against an intact bottle of Evan Williams, slowly but surely watching the pieces of the puzzle fall into place. It was about 11 p.m. at that point, still only Tuesday. Dan Stidham had had one hell of a week. It still couldn't top the last one though. That trial had been a fucking disaster. Stidham had always known the notion of a false, coerced confession would never be enough on its own. An alibi would help. A lot. Maybe so much so that he had gotten a little too eager trying to find one. He had put various friends from the trailer park on the stand to vouch for Jesse's presence in the neighborhood during those crucial hours, but the jury clearly hadn't felt they were impartial. That impression probably wasn't helped by most of them wearing yellow ribbons in support of Jesse while they testified. Well, you live and you learn. Then Stidham had pinned his hopes on a wrestling match Jesse was said to have attended in Dyers some 45 minutes out of town. To make it on time, he would have had to set off at about 7 from the trailer park. Unrealistically tight if he'd participated in the murders past 6:30. So far so good. Where things went bad was when the prosecution produced a receipt for the deposit that covered the rental of the wrestling hall for that occasion. It was dated April 27, the Wednesday prior. It was an embarrassing oversight, but in Mr. Stidham's defense, his colleagues who were to represent Damien Eccles and Jason Baldwin didn't wind up doing a whole lot better when it came to the task of placing their clients elsewhere that evening. In Jason Baldwin's case, his lawyer, Paul Ford, perhaps taking a lesson from Dan, took an approach of better safe than sorry.
Paul Ford said, I wanted my mom and all them wanted to get up and testify, and I want to get up and testify. He said, no, you ain't got to, because they didn't prove you was guilty. So he said, by law, they have to prove you guilty, you don't have to prove you're innocent.
That's one way to characterize Mr. Ford's approach. It's true that he never called an alibi witness for Baldwin, but that certainly wasn't because he was feeling cocky in light of the state's burden of proof. He clarified during a hearing for new trials in 2008 that after exercising due diligence in trying to establish an alibi for Jason, he determined he could not find a witness that he could be confident would not falter under cross-examination, saying he believed that it would be better to present no alibi at all than one that would unravel on him. If one were having a hard time seeing the wisdom in that, they need look no further than the witnesses Damien Eccles wanted his lawyers to call to the stand. His alibi for that evening has always been that he was on the phone with several girls over the course of the hour or so wherein the murders would have taken place.
At the time that the police say the murders took place, I was actually on the phone with 3 different people. The problem was the attorneys I had at the time, the public defenders, never even called them to the witness stand.
It was 4 actually. The problem was that one after the other, those girls would struggle to vouch for him. First was a 13-year-old named Holly George. She told police she spoke to Damien around 3 or 4 in the afternoon, so that was no help. Next was a friend of Holly's named Heather Client. She had actually first tried to call Jason Baldwin around 4:30 or 5, but no answer. Then she had been on the phone with both Holly George and Damien Eccles later that night, much later, around 10:15, 10:30 p.m. It isn't clear why Holly omitted her presence on this call from her statement, but in any event, the call didn't establish an alibi. Damien's girlfriend Dominique Tier couldn't do it either. She told prosecutor John Fogelman that she was with Damien in the late afternoon before he was picked up by his mom and sister at about 5:30. She next heard from him when he called her later that night, about 10. Finally, there was Jennifer Bearden. She too spoke with Damien over the phone, in the afternoon, anywhere between 4:15 and 5:30. He was at Jason's place. Then he told her that he and Jason needed to go somewhere and to call him back at his place later on at 8 p.m. When she did, Damien's grandmother told Jennifer he wasn't home yet. She eventually got through to him at about 9:20. Jennifer said Damien told her Jason's mom had taken them somewhere unspecified, which the police thought was weird because Jason's mom had worked a shift for a trucking company from 3 to 11 that night. The linking of Damien to Jason during those hours was curious, though the fact remained that there was very little in the way of physical evidence connecting them to the crime scene, certainly nothing unequivocal. But when the trial was over and the case began to spread to the court of online forums, supporters of the West Memphis Three weren't the only ones who kept digging for new discoveries. There was another vocal group who continued to insist on injecting themselves into those conversations. Non-supporters, generally referred to simply as nons. And while their cause didn't have the popularity and star power of their counterparts, on occasion they could still wrangle up something eye-catching. One such example related to the small circular injury on Stevie's forehead that supporters now theorized was a bite mark. The nons weren't having a bar of it, of course, and one by the name of Sean Wheeler even went so far as to offer an alternative culprit to a set of teeth: the knife recovered from the lake behind Jason's trailer home. He submitted that if the butt of the knife had been rammed into Stevie's forehead at some point during the attack, perhaps it would be the right make and size to leave such an impression. Not wanting his theory to rest solely on the strength of his novice observations, he sent the relevant pictures to a forensic odontologist named Peter Loomis. "Bingo," Loomis replied. "The circular mark sure looks like the butt of the survival knife. The diameter of the injury is 30 millimeters, and the diameter of the prominent circular area of the butt of the knife is 29.8 millimeters. Now, postulating the origin of an injury based off of photographs is never going to be an exact science, of course, no matter how qualified the person doing it may be, but it's just one more thing to think about. That's one of the problems with this case, isn't it? So many things to think about. Not just in terms of the evidence involved, but also, perhaps more so, the themes that it raises. One in particular being that of justice. It's been said to be better that 10 guilty men walk free than one innocent be condemned. And while most of us would likely agree with the wisdom in that, every now and again, a case comes along to really test your instincts on the notion. The police and the people of West Memphis were desperate to solve that case, and it would be callous to blame them for it. 3 innocent 8-year-old boys, perhaps much like your sons or grandsons or nephews, just out riding their bikes, disobeying their parents, all the good stuff childhood is made of. And then, well, that. Someone's got to pay, right? This isn't a win-some, lose-some sort of deal. Do you think such an imperative might cause you to lower your usual standards of proof? What might get you across the line? Questionable statements backed by broken bottles, some alarming mental health records, and disquieting periods of absence? What about a stray hair mixed with some accusations of child abuse? Would that do it for you? Oh, maybe, maybe not. Maybe it doesn't really matter. As sick as that sounds. But really, think about it, if you dare. Because while there are a lot of questions left unanswered by this case, there are a few things you can pretty much take to the bank. Terry Hobbs will never be charged for this crime. Recently there have been some lobbying efforts to have those ligatures and their associated materials retested with the latest cutting-edge technology. So far denied, but let's say they were ultimately successful and that 1.5% of the population figure was upgraded to 100% Terry Hobbs. Because Stevie lived in the same house as Terry, and both Michael and Christopher had been through that house that very afternoon, the possibility of an innocuous transfer to one of their shoelaces is plausible enough that a 2-bit defense attorney with a stuttering problem could skate their way to reasonable doubt off of it. Or imagine a different hypothetical. Say they tested something else with the latest cutting edge. Suppose that once potential semen stain on Stevie's pants got upgraded to 100% semen that 100% belongs to Damien Eccles. Oh well, that's that then. You have to remember that the three were released not on the basis that they were innocent, but that they were guilty, so their status would only be solidified, and the outcome would remain the same. Time served. Or let's say the culprit is neither of these parties. That the slayings were undertaken by some serial killer prowling through the woods that night, or just whatever other horrid creature hasn't come to light after all these years. Suppose this person or persons were incontrovertibly proven guilty and sent away for however many years they may have left after the 30 and counting they've evaded justice. Well, even in that extremely unlikely scenario, those 3 innocent 8-year-old boys will still remain dead, and all their loved ones still tortured with the anguish of knowing what unbelievable pain and terror they must have felt in the final moments before it all came to an end. Nothing changes. So, what does it really matter? Ah, where did the monsters go?